Welcome to Our Social Impact, brought to you by the Prison Scholar Fund. We have a mission of providing education and employment assistance to help incarcerated people succeed and thrive in society while avoiding homelessness and the revolving door of incarceration. My name is Dirk Van Velzen, and I'm Executive Director of the Prison Scholar Fund. Today we have Brent Orrell, the resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute.
I've admired the work of I had admired the work of AEI for many years. I had been in DC for about 30 years, including 14 on Capitol Hill and 8 in the George W. Bush administration, and then I was a consultant. And I'd always followed the Institute's work very closely, really liked it, and the opportunity came up that they were looking for somebody who knew something about workforce development, which is part of my background, and somebody who knew something about prisoner reentry, which I also knew something about. I wouldn't claim to be an expert in the sense that I don't have a PhD. I haven't run studies, randomized controlled trial studies of either workforce development or prisoner reentry, but I do have a strong interest in it, and I spent a lot of time working on it.
And then is it resident scholar? I mean, you're there full time?
Yeah, I'm at AEI full time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did you go there under the workforce development angle and then became criminal justice reform?
It was really both. They were looking for a scholar to replace another really good guy, Gerard Robinson, who had been at AEI for a couple of years. And he had spun off his own nonprofit work that he was going to do in education, so they needed somebody to work on that issue. They also, AEI had also, especially over the last 5 years or so, really gotten into the workforce space because it's so critical to economic mobility and some of the challenges that we're facing as a country of people not having access to good family-sustaining jobs. So I care about both of those things. I worked in both of those things, and so that's how I wound up there.
Yeah, you guys are all over the place because I met Gerard. I think I met him in Denver in one of your Bridging Divide summits,
Right.
And I met him about a month after that in DC.
Mm-hmm.
He was hosting a briefing for bringing the Pell Grant back.
Yeah, he's and we're part of that coalition of organizations. Actually, AEI as an organization doesn't take positions on issues. Only scholars take positions on issues. But so and that's Gerard is an important part of that effort that's going on in DC to try to change the law around Pell Grants for prisoners.
And did you continue some of the work he developed, or did you come with your own agendas to work on?
I think it's always everybody brings their own kind of angle on this. My angle, I can't really speak too much to sort of Gerard's angle, although I will say that he's gone into education work after he left AEI. So I think that's like where his main interest is, and I know he came out of education policy. So I come out of workforce policy and poverty policy. So those are kind of the way that I take on the issue. I'm really interested in what we know about and what we can do about the conditions that give rise to communities that give rise to communities experiencing a high impact from people returning from prison. My own introduction to the issue, I really didn't know very much about reentry. I was working on Capitol Hill. I came to the Labor Department. It was right before 9/11 happened. And so before we could even really get started on anything, there was 9/11, and that emergency sort of took over everything that was happening. And I used that as an opportunity to go out and try to get my hands around what was going on in the United States, meeting with community leaders and people who lead organizations like yours, actually, And the issue that kept coming up over and over again was this thing called reentry. Reentry, which is a big problem where community leaders saying to me, well, we're knitting as fast as we can here, trying to hold this community together. And we're being inundated by people coming home from prison, and they are undoing our work. They're unraveling faster than we can knit, and we really need something to break that cycle. So what they told me was that employment was a huge issue. For people coming home from prison, that was no one had really made much progress on the ban the box issue. There was a lot of actual and perceived discrimination against people who had criminal records. And so while other people were over here kind of working on the let's change the law side, I was like, okay, what can we do on the other side? Like, how can we better support the people who are trying to make this transition? We're Republicans. We have access to employers. Maybe they'll listen to us. Maybe they will be more willing to engage if it's a Republican administration talking to them rather than a Democratic administration. So we had some focus groups with employers to try to get them to talk a little bit about what it was that was the main obstacle to them hiring people with criminal records. And what we found, we would sit down with them and, okay, we get it. This is a risk, right, for you to hire somebody who's been in prison. If an employer knowingly hires somebody with a felony record, and that person commits another crime, say against another employee or against a customer, it's a huge liability issue for them. And that's what it turned out. That's what it was. It wasn't that they didn't want to be good citizens. They didn't want to, extend an opportunity to people who are trying to restart their lives. They were completely into all of that. But the liability issues are really creating a big problem for them. So, how do you deal with that?
How do you deal with that?
Yeah. So
I know there's those tax incentives.
Well, that was already in existence when I arrived on the scene, and things like the federal bonding program were also available. But when we asked employers about those incentives, what they said to us was, those are really not the place to start the conversation. Like to say to somebody, we will pay you to hire this person, immediately kind of
that doesn't change the risk picture.
Yeah, it doesn't change the risk picture, and it sets off this kind of alarm bell. And then you say, here's this special insurance that I've got.
We know it's going to be risky. So here's some things to mitigate it.
Yeah, and it's risky, and we're reminding you of how risky it is.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so those programs were not very appealing on their own to employers, right? So what we proposed as an alternative was, what if somebody coming home from prison came to you via a community organization? An organization that was that specialized in dealing with all of the non-work related barriers that people coming home from prison have, right? They're going to help with the transportation, they're going to help with the housing, they're going to help with the referrals to substance abuse, mental health, or whatever it is that somebody coming home from prison might need. And the needs are often quite extensive, as you know. So what you could see in those focus groups is when you started introducing those ideas, the anxiety levels began to fall. It's like, well, what it was that when you come home from prison, you've been in prison, you've broken faith with everybody. If you've gone to prison, you've broken faith with your family, and you've broken faith with the community, with business, with schools. Everybody has had enough of you. Right. Right. So
a lot of times more than once.
Yeah. So to have an organization say, look, we're working with this person. They've made a change. They want they want to do right by themselves, by their families, by the community, by your business. And then the person is no longer just this free radical, I completely isolated on their own.
But then, like in this example, you might have people that join those programs that want to change their lives, which would be a different person than the one that doesn't join the program,
Right.
which would be the one that's really maybe needs the help.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of help the highest risk group that's probably most likely to reoffend? Because maybe the people joining those programs are kind of already got their head on straight,
Yeah.
and they might not reoffend.
Right. So there's a huge issue. There's always a big issue of selection bias in these programs.
So people are messy. Like, how do you
Right.
account for the selection bias?
Right. Well, typically what you do to account for selection bias is use randomized assignment. So you take a group of people and you divide them in half. They're roughly the same types of people. Maybe they've committed similar types of crimes. Maybe they kind of, to the naked eye or to the research eye, kind of look like similarly risky, similar levels of risk. And you divide them up, and half of the people get the program and the other half don't get the program, and then you compare their outcomes and you decide, did the intervention make any difference? We didn't do that because we didn't have the resources for a randomized control trial. We just wanted to see if maybe this might be helpful. And it looked pretty good the first few years. We saw substantially lower rates of reoffending among people taking part in this than kind of the general world, but we weren't doing a control trial, so we couldn't say.
Just evaluating the data.
Yeah, it's just program data. We're just looking for it. It looks pretty good for the first couple of years, and then the further out that you get, the lower the positives were. Everything sort of reverted to the mean, even in this sort of bias sample.
You're not breaking the cycle.
Even for people that were relatively maybe more motivated, still wasn't working.
So they're doing okay for a couple of years, and just kind of fall back to old patterns.
Yeah, and even in randomized control trials where there's a fade out in terms of the impact over time, and that even more kind of challenging from my perspective is that it's possible to make the case that the control groups, people who don't receive services in these randomized control trials, are doing about as well and maybe even a little bit better than the people who get services.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So what happens there?
So, and this is kind of the direction that my work at AEI has taken around this issue, which is we don't know whether that's some sort of weird artifact of the research, whether it's an actual thing that we need to pay attention to. But the pattern is consistent enough that we at least need to take it into consideration. Like, is there something that we're doing that is actually making the problem worse for some people?
So almost like the Hawthorne effect, just like studying them makes them misbehave, or
possibly the Hawthorne effect, or it could be that, and this is kind of the intuition that I'm working off right now, is maybe we're not, maybe we don't know as much as we need to know, and maybe it's not possible to know enough to really help people based on their individual circumstances through kind of a centralized program. What if we took a different approach that really tried to leverage people who are returning from prison, leverage their own capacity to sort of understand their own lives and make decisions about their own lives.
So what would that look like?
Okay, so good question.
Well, before we get there, too, like, what kind of studies did you evaluate? Was like a meta-analysis, and you reviewed a lot of other existing
So we assembled a working group of researchers. We're going to be issuing a report here in the next month on sort of what that working group, what that conversation was like. We actually didn't come to a consensus on what we ought to do about this, but we we assembled these researchers, people who had worked for decades in mostly PhD, social scientists, economists, people who worked around this issue, studied a lot of programs. And so we brought them together and we kind of talked this through. And so that insight that I mentioned about like the control groups doing as well, and sometimes a little bit better than the treatment groups, came from a researcher who's been doing this for like 35 years, and she studied the SVORI program, the Serious and Violent Offender Initiative out of the Department of Justice from the 1990s. She studied a number of other major reentry initiatives, and she's the one who brought this forward and said, this is really a challenge to us, that not only are we not helping, it looks like we may be getting in the way a little bit for some people in terms of their ability to successfully transition.
Huh.
So there was a lot of silence in the room around that conversation.
Yeah, because it seems like there's tons of data that does support some things work.
Yeah.
It's almost like you could probably have a big data battle to see whose data, which data set you're looking at, which programs you're evaluating.
Right.
Is it education, transition?
Right. Yeah. Right. So like the data around education, the RAND study is probably the best thing out there. There's data around case management for some populations seems to make a difference. Cognitive behavioral therapy, especially if you live in Sweden or Norway, seems to make a big difference. That's where most of those studies are.
It's funny because if you want to compare for those Norwegian or the Scandinavian countries, the culture is so different.
Yeah.
I was we have a Google volunteer, and he's from the Netherlands, and he was saying the reason that homelessness doesn't really exist in Sweden, for example, is because if you're homeless, people will run up to you and say, "What is going on? What is wrong with you? Let's help." It's a totally different social fabric of people supporting each other.
So there's a famous anecdote from Milton Friedman, the conservative economist, and he was meeting with the Prime Minister of Sweden many years ago. I don't even know who the Prime Minister was, but they were talking about the issue of poverty, and the Swedish Prime Minister said, "Well, that in Sweden we don't really have poverty, and Friedman responded, "Yes, we've noticed that among Swedes in America too. They aren't poor. Like there's something in the culture of Sweden that insulates people against poverty, and some people have traced it back actually just how difficult it was to survive in those communities in the medieval period and later.
Oh, interesting.
Like the work ethic, everybody
you had to be a tight community to survive.
Yeah, you had to be a tight community to survive, and you had to work really hard. So that's why it's like, well, can we really transfer any of that knowledge, based on cultural differences?
And people would also say they have so many support services because they tax them at like 70%. I don't know what the tax rate really is over there. Do you have any idea how high it is?
I was just reading yesterday. I think that I think it's about 80%. Yeah, but you get, you're getting just your whole life paid for basically via government programs. So
you really can't compare that because I don't think that would fly in America.
No, that definitely wouldn't fly. And just to back on the reentry issue, I mean, it's like there aren't that many people in prison in Scandinavian countries, right? So everybody gets their own psychologist, like a dedicated person. Well, it's very intensive treatment of people in prisons. More
of a safety. It's like we see you're here. We want to know why.
We're
here to help you.
Well, you're kind of you're an oddity.
Yeah. What happened?
What happened to you? And how can we make it better?
Yeah.
And how can we make you better? Anyway, so you're right. There is something called the What Works literature around reentry, and there are these individual elements of programs that seem to make a difference. Like I said, cognitive behavioral therapy, mentoring, family visits seem to make a difference. If you're visited by your family in prison, those people seem to do better when they get out. mental health and substance abuse treatment seem to make a difference in terms of reducing recidivism. So there are these individual things, right, that sometimes seem to help some populations. Case management seems to do better with, can't remember whether it's with juveniles. It's either juveniles or adults that seem to show some results around case management. I can't remember which, but the other group doesn't. Okay, so they've got these individual things that sometimes seem to make a difference. What we don't have is evidence of sort of coordinated interventions that that set out with their goal of trying to keep people from coming back from prison, and they're kind of coordinated longitudinal interventions. That there's no evidence around those programs right now that they do better than not doing anything, and that's a problem in the long term, right? It's a little hard to go to the taxpayer and say keep funding this stuff when we don't have anything that says it's working. Now, some of the folks in our working group say, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater on this. There are things that work. We need to keep trying. We need better data. We need more faithful implementation of programs. That's one of the big issues. It's like if you get something that you think works and then you hand it off to somebody, try to get them to do it, you can't get it to replicate.
Yeah.
Right. So because they're not doing it right, or they leave out certain elements, they modify.
Yeah, it's going from someone really passionate about the subject to maybe an administrator.
Yeah, or just like there's somebody who says, well, I think this thing has 4 elements, A, B, C, and D, but we don't really like C. We don't think it works. So we're not going to do C. We're only going to do A, B, and D. And then are you really testing the same thing at that point? You're not testing this. You're testing a new model. Well, the new model didn't work, right? So was it because we left C out? Or is there some other confounding factor in that? It's very difficult. Social science research, it's just very difficult to isolate what's going on and really get to the bottom of why it worked here and didn't work there. So the argument for among some of the scholars on our working group was we just need to keep trying. We need to be better about how we implement. We need to collect better or different data, and we need to be more patient. That sometimes you don't see this you don't see the results in the first 3 years. You see them in years 4, 5, and 6. We need to be more realistic about what we can expect out of these programs. We need to define success differently, right? So it's going back. We're saying unless somebody doesn't go back to prison, this has failed. But what if we're lengthening the time between episodes of incarceration? Does that count as success? So that's sort of one side of this argument among our research team, and I'm willing to entertain all of that. We can do better. We can implement more faithfully. We can collect data differently. We can redefine the problem in ways that we can see some positive effects. So I'm totally willing to go down that path. While we're doing that, I'm interested in seeing if there is an alternative that really focuses on building up the capacity of people who are in prisons to make decisions about and guide their own lives, right? Because I always say to people that reentry is a jigsaw puzzle. Reentry is a jigsaw. It's got all sorts of different possible combinations. It's like a Rubik's Cube. And every prisoner has their own puzzle, right? So what works for me might not work for you or that person over there, because they've got something in their lives, some different experience that means that what works for me isn't going to work for them. So what we're going to put out on the table, AEI, me as a scholar, I am as a scholar, is a proposal that we try to combine the individual elements that we see have positive effects. Case management, cognitive behavioral therapy, substance abuse, mental health services. We try to combine those things into a single pre-release program that would be kind of like what we've seen a little bit on with some of the faith-based work, where you create a Muslim unit or a Christian unit, or transcendental meditation unit, where people go into that unit and they are immersed in that. So we
have a supportive community.
Yeah, a therapeutic, right, a supportive therapeutic community. Everybody's on the same page, pursuing the same philosophy, but we do that with cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a method of counseling that helps people identify what their triggers are, and then develop new ways of navigating around those triggers, right? So if I've got an anger problem, I'm probably always, to one degree or another, going to have that anger problem, but I can develop new ways of coping with that anger problem, new ways of kind of sliding around it rather than just sort of falling into it over and over again.
So is that kind of therapy initially pretty effective for extinction over the long term? Or what are the programs that you found in a year or two people reverted back?
It is subject to some of the same kinds of fade outs, but it is one of those things that seems to make a difference. It makes a difference in the lives of people who aren't in prison. That's kind of why I'm like, maybe this is something we ought to look at, is creating CBT units, basically. Is that CBT is very effective in helping people with eating disorders and helping people with all kinds of life change issues, with anxiety problems, with all sorts of things. It's effective at helping people develop new coping mechanisms. So let's try it with this population.
Yeah. So kind of one idea might be maybe the programs per se aren't really that effective, but maybe just the attention they're having, the human interaction, the community they're building, and kind of when they have that support while they're incarcerated, that's pretty effective. And then when they get out, you have the fade out.
Yeah.
And then once they're in the harsh realities of the real world, they don't have that community.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a huge factor. I agree completely. That.
If they don't have a family and they don't have friends and they're just by themselves,
right?
Then what?
Right. So this is part 2 of the project.
Okay. I mean, we're gonna hit it.
Yeah. So, what I'd like to see is, in addition to the CBT process that people are going through, at the same time, they're getting coaching to help them map out a plan for what they're going to do once they get out. One element I neglected to mention was we also want to do risk assessments. Like what is it? What are the things that are really going to trip you up once you get out of here? Is it addiction? Is it lack of community? Is it I've got a serious anger management problem, or I've got a substance abuse problem? These are the things that are likely to get in the way of a successful transition. So you kind of identify those while you're going through the CBT process. And then you've got a coach that's helping you design a plan, but it's really your design. It's the prisoner's design. This is what I think will make the biggest difference for me.
They take some ownership in crafting their future.
Right, because I think that for many people who have been in prison, not all certainly, but many who have been in prison, they've been subject to government interventions for a long time. And people have really, it may have started out with child protective services when they were kids, and then progressed to the public school system, trying to do stuff to address these emerging problems. Then there was juvenile justice, trying to divert kids away from criminal activity. really prison is just society's last line of, we don't know what else to do with you.
It's funny you say that,
Yeah.
because one of the interviews we have coming up is a school teacher,
Mhm.
and I think she's at the 4th, 5th grade level, and she says, I know who's going to prison at this moment because I see them. So it's like, we're farther down the stream. Like,
Yeah,
it's probably a tougher job to change that behavior
Yeah.
when they're adults, but how do you change it when they're 4 years old and you can identify?
Yeah.
And we don't know if she's right or not. Like, she sees
Yeah.
some kids and she thinks they're going to prison, but
unfortunately, I think she probably is right.
and that's the place to fix it. So how do we?
Well, okay, let's finish out this, then we'll go
Yeah.
back to kind of the upstream
Perfect.
stuff. Okay, so so you've got this coach that's working with you, developing your reentry, working with you, you're developing your reentry plan, you've got ownership, you are, maybe this is one of the few times in your life where somebody has said to you, you're really in charge of this. We can't really do it for you. We've tried intervening with you. And that's maybe led you to the conclusion that somebody's always going to be there trying to prevent you from doing something that's damaging to yourself, self-harming. Now you have to step up, you have to own this, you have to make it it's got to be your plan. All right, so you develop this, I own this is my plan, this is what I'm going to do. Combine that in this construct that I'm trying to develop, you combine that with a voucher that can be used to address the issues in your plan, right? So you have your plan, you have your voucher, and then you probably need a directory of services, right? So here are the organizations in the community that provide the kinds of services that you might be interested in going to, but you have to go choose. You have to go shop for who it is that you want to help you.
And it kind of fills the safety net of, when I got released, I had a family, I had a dad, I had close, people I had support. So this would be like, if they have no support,
Right.
it's kind of filling the gap of.
Maybe I'm going to use my voucher for training at the local community college to get a credential in something. Or
So it's really individualized.
Yeah,
really,
it's very self-directed, right? Now, obviously you have to have somebody signing off on that. It's not a credit card that you can just go and blow on whatever you want.
You can see all sorts of trouble there.
Yeah. So you've got to have some
It's gonna
accountability.
end up on the black market real fast.
Yeah. You've got to have some accountability. The money doesn't get released until you've got your coach's sign off that this is legitimate expense.
Some kind of case manager to monitor this process.
Yeah. But and that case manager should also be there when that person hits the snag, and says, God, I'm really frustrated. I can't find the thing that I need, or I've got this other issue I didn't really anticipate. What should I do? So you've got somebody to kind of bounce that stuff off of.
And that's actually a unique relationship between the returning citizen and the case manager, because a lot of times the way that's structured now is it's almost like a gotcha. They're just waiting for that one person to slip up so they throw them back in prison, as opposed to maybe a partnership for success. How do they really work together to build that trust to let them know that we're here for you?
Yeah, exactly. And I think a very important element of this is that this isn't just something that's happening. It's not just the prison system and the guards and the administrators in the prison that need to be involved. It's also the people in the probation system, parole system that need to understand who they're working with, because they've heard every story 1,000 times. Got a hard shell from a lot of disappointment, but they need to be part of this. Say, all right, this person has this background, they've been prepared in this way. These are the tools this is an additional tool that you as a reentry official have to work with. So they need to be brought into this continuum as well.
There'd have to be a lot of training involved, because as soon as one person confirms their bias, they're going to say, see, we told you guys more, therefore we're not going to be a partner in this.
Right. And I have a lot of sympathy for that. I really, and a lot of empathy for the people who work in prisons.
If you can imagine, if your career is 20 years being lied to on a daily basis, you're not going to be very sympathetic.
Yeah.
So it'd be an interesting person that can be a human after all of that.
And I think that one of the things I like that I would like to see in the CBT approach is that it's not just the prisoners and the therapists who are engaged in this, but it's really everybody who's touching those people in the prison system as well. They're being brought into this therapeutic community as well, because frankly, they're subject to a lot of secondary trauma. They're seeing a lot of bad things happening, and I have compassion for that as well as the people who are trying to get their lives straightened out. We're doing a lot of damage to people in prison, and some of the people who are being damaged by it are actually the people who work there. So trying to incorporate everybody into this therapeutic community, I think, is important.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting perspective.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you saw it. I'm sure you've heard about it. What does it mean for somebody to show up to work every day to see some really bad behavior on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, it's funny. There's also this really weird dynamic between the prisoners and the guards. And once some of the prisoners, they realize that they have more in common with the guards than the guards really want to let on, because the guards are really the lowest level of the criminal justice pyramid. They have the people at the top, but the guards really have to follow order from everybody else. And so the guards really, their only response is they get to kick the people right below them, which are the prisoners. But the prisoners know that, and so when the guards say something like, "Hey, well, I get to go home," they'll kind of taunt the prisoner with that "I get to go home" statement. But the prisoner will come back and say, "Hey, how many more years do you have until retirement? I'm going home next year." It's like a lot of prison guards, they're doing 20 years to get their retirement.
Yeah.
And everyone realizes prison sucks, whether you're an inmate doing a year or two and you go home, or if you're a prison guard and you're doing 20 years, you're spending 8 hours a day in an environment that's terrible with people that don't like you.
Right.
And even your supervisors probably don't like you too much. So it's an interesting.
And what medicine and psychology tell us about what happens to people who are exposed to that chronically?
Yeah.
It's not good. The report on the Alabama prison system that came out a few months ago, just shockingly terrible conditions. One of those things, not the most important thing, but one of the things that the report found were people who were working, stories of guards falling asleep on their feet because they're working so much overtime, because Alabama won't hire more guards because those guards are long-term expenses to the state of Alabama. You got to fund retirements and healthcare and all of that, so they don't want to hire any more people. Meanwhile, the prison population is huge, anyway, I think we need to have compassion for people in prison, and that includes the people who work there, because I think they're really being traumatized by that experience.
Yeah, even other parallels. Who's the guy that just died? Epstein?
Epstein, yeah.
I think the response from the federal prison system was like, "Hey, our guys are working 60, 70 hours a week.
Yeah.
They don't have the capacity to monitor every all the time."
Yeah.
So it's a multifaceted problem.
Right. So the end of all of this is, and this is what I'm advocating for, is that, so I've articulated a different kind of approach. I think it's got a lot of potential problems in it. We know that the existing system has also got a lot of problems in it.
There's lots of room for improvement.
There are lots of room for improvement. But what I think we need is experimentation. We know that what we're doing isn't working, so we've got to try something new. And it's got to be kind of outside the box that we're used to working in. And that's why I want to focus on this agency question, personal agency. Can we do anything around that? And we're about to get into a project with the RAND Corporation, actually, looking at how we might be able to apply some of what we've learned out of the behavioral health world and apply it in the prisons and prison setting. Like, how do you change diet? How do you change exercise behaviors? We've learned a lot about that. Can we apply any of that learning to the incarceration and reentry space?
So since you have a really exciting experimental program,
Yeah.
who pays for that? 'Cause
Okay.
the government likes to pay for programs for argument's sake should be working.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
they might not
right,
be working. But
right, right. No, I think it's another good question. I think you just have to look at, all right, we're spending billions.
That's pretty
right?
clear.
Yeah, we're spending billions already. Is there a way to take a small fraction of that and apply it to an experimental model that we could rigorously evaluate and figure out, is this having an impact on that? If it doesn't, shut it down. I'm willing to live with that. I don't always believe that the prison industrial complex and the criminal justice industrial complex is willing to live with that. It's not working, so we need to shut it down. That more often than not, the answer is no, I'm not willing to do that. All right, I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to put an idea out there, say, let's try it, and then if it works, great. If it doesn't work, let's go look for something else. But what's not acceptable to me is that we continue to spend all of this money and not only not help people, but we may actually be making the situation worse. That's a challenge that we need to address.
So this seems to make sense.
Okay.
And a funny story about that is I did a talk at Google, and when I kind of mapped out the whole recidivism problem, education seems to reduce recidivism. Everyone knows that, so let's do more of that. And some of the Googlers in the audience were like, I don't get it. They're like, if education works and recidivism seems to recidivism drops after education, and it saves a lot of money also.
Mm-hmm.
So why aren't they doing it? They couldn't get their heads around it until somebody stood up in the audience and said, well, it's because it's the government, and the government isn't logical.
Mm.
And they're like, oh, well, that makes sense. So then how do we...
I think that's overly simplistic. I think government is a reflection of who we are as a people, and
we have the government we deserve.
Yeah, or something that approximates it.
Yeah.
Yes. So years ago, we said, no more Pell Grants. If you've committed a crime and you're in prison, why should we spend any more money on your education? We've spent a lot of money on you already, and we're spending tons more money while we got you in prison. There are a lot of people who haven't committed crimes, and what we're saying is, to those people who play by the rules, that they're not going to get something so that we can give it to you. And the public found that to be a very compelling argument. And so Congress took that step to eliminate Pell Grants for prisoners. We can now see...
and even that argument was flawed, because if a prisoner was getting the Pell Grant, it doesn't mean someone else isn't getting it.
Right.
It's every one of those need-based.
Right. But it's sort of I think it's a easy sort of cheap shot argument that appeals to sort of a populist sentiment.
And that was during the war on drugs, the tough on crime days.
Yeah.
Like, they conflated being tough on prisoners or being tough on crime as being tough on criminals.
Mm-hmm.
So they're being really tough on criminals, thinking that was going to affect the crime rate.
Yeah, there's something in American culture, I think, that says once you've committed a crime, you deserve to be punished forever. We take, at least in the abstract, right?
Yeah.
When we think about those people, all those thousands of people, millions of people behind bars right now, they've done something really bad, and they deserve what they're getting, and they deserve to keep getting it. Now, if it's somebody we know, if it's your uncle, your brother,
he's okay.
Yeah, he made a mistake.
Yeah. Isn't it so funny how second chances are personal?
Yeah. So, but at the level of kind of politics, there's a reason that politicians use those sound bites. It's because they work. They rile people up, and they say, "Damn right, that person needs to go away forever."
And nor is that even more reflective in social media posts. Like, somebody will post something, and you just see a whole stream of this onslaught of terrible stuff.
Yeah. So there's definitely something in our in our culture that really likes the idea of the eye for the eye, the tooth for the tooth, and a very kind of, for lack of a better expression, kind of an Old Testament view of justice. There's not a lot of grace and forgiveness out there when it comes to, again, at the abstract level. There's not a lot of grace and forgiveness. And so, I think that's a huge barrier to any kind of anything new that you want to try to address crime and recidivism.
So how do you change the culture, the punitive culture?
That's
a bigger problem.
One thing that I know doesn't help is to have a lot of programs that fail.
Yeah.
Then people just say it's hopeless, nothing works, and so we just need to stop doing everything. That's not my view. That's not what I want. But it's not unreasonable, I think, for people to look at sort of the widespread failure of programs to reduce recidivism and say, this problem cannot be fixed. We're wasting our time. Building prisons and keeping people locked up may be the most effective thing on offer. That's not an unreasonable conclusion to reach. I don't think it is. I think it's an incredible waste, not just of money, of dollars, but of lives. And so I think we have to keep trying. But it's not unreasonable for people to just walk away from the issue. What we can't do is just keep throwing money at this and expect the public's patience to be inexhaustible.
Yeah, we got to have some wins.
Yeah, got to have some wins. So we need to at least show that we're trying.
Yeah,
let's try this.
We're a storytelling culture, anyways. If
Yeah.
you have a couple wins, a couple of stories, like maybe that can sway people.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you have a project in the works right now. What state are you? Are you putting in?
I work for a think tank, so
Yeah.
we don't do projects. We come up
inform.
we come up with ideas
Okay.
and suggest that other people take them on, and so that's sort of the next stage of this. We'll have a volume based on the work of our. So we've got this report coming out, which is this is the report on the discussion that happened, and then in the fall we're going to release a volume of essays written by the people on this working group that cover kind of these major topic areas that we've been talking about, and then I'll have a chapter in there that kind of lays out this alternative model. So once we get that done, I'm really hoping that we can interest a couple enterprising governors to invest in trying it.
And how does that conversation happen? So you got this really great idea, and then how do you have a conversation with the governor, or any states come to you and say, hey, we all have this problem, but we'd like to try something. What do you have in mind?
So, I think every governor is looking at this issue. It's a gigantic fiscal issue for states, is funding prisons. And they are desperate to find ways of emptying these jails in a way that protects public safety, that's consistent with public safety. So,
except for the guards unions, I heard they're kind of pretty.
Well,
powerful.
yeah. Although I think even that has there's a diminishing return on that. It's just like not every governor is captive to the guards unions, and the fiscal realities of this will eventually force.
It's just so expensive.
Yeah, it's just incredibly expensive. So, a couple of governors who want to try to reach out to people who really have taken on board this issue and see if they'd be willing to partner with us, get some foundations to help fund it, so that it's not just taxpayer money, but we've got some philanthropic money on the table as well.
Some risk capital, so to speak,
Yeah.
to keep this thing off.
Especially around the vouchers. I think that it's going to be hard to make the case, like with the Pell Grants, that we're going to give somebody coming home from prison a voucher for $4,000 or $5,000. It's like, hey, I'd like that. My kid would like that. He hasn't, why? So maybe not make that taxpayer funded, but see if we could get a foundation to pay for that.
It kind of makes sense. the government should invest that because on the back end they can save a lot more. They can save like what's the average cost of incarcerated person?
Yeah, so the oldest argument in government is you got to spend money to save money. Everybody says that.
Yeah.
I think
the programs don't always work.
The programs usually don't work, and then
then
so I think getting the private money in there to say, look, this is a risk. We recognize it's a risk. We're trying it. We want the public to fund the stuff behind the wall, and we want private philanthropy to fund the stuff outside the wall.
So that sounds like a prime ground for social impact bonds.
Yeah, possibly.
Are those? Have you explored that, or?
I know a little bit about social impact bonds. I think there are a lot of different ways of getting it done, and I think
get a pilot done first, and then
I think we need to have some enterprising governors and prison officials who say, yeah, this makes sense to us. We're willing to try. We're willing to invest. The most important investment that a governor or a warden or the system can make is just leadership. It's like it's so easy to just say, I've got too much to do already, and I don't want to take this on. But if you could get some motivated leaders involved in this, I think that would really help.
So it's about $4,000 or $5,000 per person.
That's about what we're spending in federal reentry programs right now. It's about $4,000 or $5,000 a head.
And how many people in the study would you want to have?
Actually, we're spending about $8,000 per head. What I'm suggesting is you could probably do this more cheaply because you don't have so much overhead.
Okay. And then how many people would have to be in the program to have significant data?
Another good question, and I don't know the answer to it. We'd have to ask. People who design research studies for a living to tell us, what are the numbers that we need to hit in order to have some statistical power.
And then just as we were talking earlier, people are messy. So how do you?
Well, but I think that this approach actually takes into account the messiness because it's
individualized per person.
Yeah, and the person themselves is really in charge of it rather than an outside organization or the government or a nonprofit, whatever it is. It's really driven by the individual who is like you and I. We're constantly calculating what we need to do next in order to get through our day, to finish our project, to do the next, to advance what we're trying to do. That we're relying on that. That's the beating heart of this is that I think that there may be a significant number of people who have or can develop the capacity to make their own decisions and be more successful than we can be for them.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's like an exciting program.
Yeah.
So what's your next steps on it?
So we got to finish this volume, get that published, and then we need to spend some time with some governors to see if we can get them to invest leadership resources, maybe some taxpayer money is involved on some of the behind the wall activities. So
you got a couple of phone calls you're going to make?
Yeah, I got a couple of phone calls, a lot of pleading, a
lot
of begging.
I don't know if you want to disclose who you're talking to, but it sounds like you probably got
No, I don't want to talk about anybody that I might be thinking about, but there are some governors out there who, and almost all of them really care about this, and some of them are invested in trying to do something different. So we'll be talking to them.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
I look forward to what you do next.
Yeah. Do you want to go back to the upstream issues?
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So, there's a really great program, one of my favorite programs that I've encountered in 30 years of looking at this kind of stuff. It's based in Portland, just down the road a couple hours where we are. They also have a chapter here in Seattle. And it's called The Friends of the Children. Very interesting story behind it. The man who founded it, his name is Duncan Campbell, and he was one of the kids that we're talking about when he was a young man. Very troubled family situation.
Second grade terror.
I don't know what his actual behavior was. I just know that Somehow he reached the conclusion, or very early in life, that he was not going to relive his parents' experience of alcohol addiction and violence and
So there's a lot of family stuff.
a lot of family stuff going on. So he got himself through high school. He talks a lot about his involvement in high school sports and how the families of his teammates actually made a huge difference in his life.
So it sounds like he's pretty self-aware.
Yeah,
Which is probably unusual for those.
Yeah, he talks about being 3 years old. His parents are out at the bar and him going out in his pajamas to try to bring them home. So that's not your typical 3-year-old behavior. And very self-aware. He actually came to the Bridging the Divide Summit. He was one of our speakers there. So maybe, I think we recorded all that. Maybe you can listen to him talk. Wonderful man. Anyway, he went on to graduate, got an MBA, got a law degree. He founded a timber brokerage, became the second largest timber brokerage in the world. And once he made his money, he decided that he wanted to try to help kids who were like him when he was growing up, that came out of those kind of same circumstances. So interesting. The first thing he did not do was to try to go out and actually establish a program. First thing that he did was he hired a researcher to go and survey all of the literature around mentoring. What works? What really works? What do we need to do? And it was he wanted to build on whatever the research, the evidence is telling us works. So what he landed on is a program that pairs paid professional mentors. These are typically college graduates. Some have degrees in social work. Others are just, they majored in the social science or education, whatever. And what they do is they pair these mentors with the highest risk kids that they can find. And they find those kids by going into kindergarten classrooms, observe in low-income communities, the most troubled communities in Portland, Seattle, and other cities around the country. They go in and they observe for 6 weeks. And what they're looking for is something called negative externalizing behavior, which is all the acting out. Because what the psychology research shows us is that those behaviors are the things that turn into negative adult behaviors, right? They're the things that turn into substance abuse. They're the things that turn into violence. They're the things that turn into incarceration and educational failure and dropout from high school and early parenting, having kids before.
So they kind of identify the markers.
You're looking for those kids. You're going right to, it's the opposite of a selection bias. Because what they're looking for are the kids who are the most troubled. They're going right to the bottom of the barrel, and they're saying, we want the kids who are the biggest problems. So they pair those folks with mentors, and those mentors stay with them until they graduate from high school.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And so long as that child is living within a 30-mile radius of the headquarters of the organization, they're in the program. If they leave for a while, they can always come back. It's an unconditional commitment to the kids. And the outcomes are really quite remarkable.
So do the mentors usually stay on for years over years?
Yeah, they require at least a 3-year commitment, and then their average is about 7 years. And
that's a long time for a mentor.
Yeah, it's a long time for a mentor, and they're very intentional about transitions. So if a mentor says,
so pop one in, pop one out.
Yeah, if a mentor says that, I need to move on, I'm getting a new job, or I'm moving out of the area, I'm leaving, they take a long time to make the transition between the new mentor and the old mentor, so that the kids who are often, they're coming out of traumatized backgrounds where there's been a lot of loss already. That one of the things they're trying to teach is that life is all about transitions, and you've got to be able to make transitions, and there's good ways to make transitions. It doesn't have to be a negative. It can be something that's really positive. So they stay with these kids. They spend a couple hours a week typically with them.
And when do they move in, and when do they identify the problems with the child? Because I know the earlier they intervene, the better.
Yeah. So this is kindergarten,
Okay.
which is pretty early. I think the brain science on this suggests that going even earlier would make sense.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
The science behind the nurse home visiting program of really working with moms and infants to improve parenting behaviors, which is where a lot of these problems arise. Is kids aren't parented well when they're infants, and then
it goes all the way back to those monkey experience, the wire cage, the rhesus monkey. I forget that what it was called.
I know the experiment you're talking about.
And from that point forward, once they didn't have that attachment or the nurturing, just off the rails.
No, you don't want to be too deterministic about this. People are very resilient. The brain is very plastic. It can recover. But
is that maybe part of the problem with society? Like, people are so deterministic, like, well, they're broken, they're never going to be fixed.
I think we have to really pay attention to that and not fall either by laziness or cynicism into a kind of despair, because people can change.
Because that's the idea. It's like, if all these problems manifest when they're in fourth grade and they're unfixable, then what are we doing when they're in prison and when they're in their 20s or 30s? Is it fixable at that point, or is it?
Was it fixable for you?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like, what happened to me? It's like, I can't be that unique.
Right. So people can change. People do change. What we need to avoid is both this determinism that, after 18 months you're done, or I'm just going to stick you in a box because you're incorrigible. So again, Friends of the Children takes the most challenging kids, mentors them for 12 years, and what they found is that 90% of them graduate from high school. 90%, not over 90%, avoid early parenting. 90% avoid substance abuse, and they're not going into prison for sure.
And that's called Friends of Children?
Friends of the Children. And there's a chapter here in Seattle, and they've got, the headquarters is in Portland. Pardon me. And they've got, they're in Los Angeles, they're actually in Klamath Falls, they're all over now Florida, Texas, Illinois, Boston, New York. So they're all kind of now growing all over the country.
Very cool.
Yeah. So I think that's the kind of upstream stuff that we need to be thinking about if we want to turn off the spigot of people who are making their way into our prisons. So
where does your research go after this?
Okay, so I think in this domain around crime and incarceration, I'm really interested in this human agency question.
And how did you get interested? Like, like every time you talk about it, your face lights up. So
human agency?
How did you get so excited, passionate about it?
Because I think that, well, it could be somewhat related. My dad, who passed away a couple of years ago, he grew up in Philadelphia during the Great Depression, went into the Navy, eventually made his way out to the West Coast, where he met my mom, who grew up here in Washington State. And he always said that if he hadn't made that move to come out west, he would have probably, after he left the Navy, gone back to the neighborhood he grew up in and wound up either dead or in jail, just because the environment was really bad. but there was something in him that said, there's more is possible. And so he struck out. He had one of his sisters had moved out west. So there's a whole chain of like kind of weird circumstances that lead people to where they are. But there's something, I think there are internal drives in people that we need to tap into in order to help them change their lives. They are the only ones who can change their lives. There's something in, I believe that human beings are natural problem solvers if they have the opportunity to solve problems, and if they have the kind of basic skills to solve problems. And so that's what human agency is. It's like, I can actually sit down and think about my life, reflect on my life, and say, either I'm doing well and I want to keep doing it, or there's some things that I need to change in order for me to succeed and to flourish in life. I'm big on human flourishing. I think that that's one of the main one of my main interests is how do we help support, recognize, and enable the flourishing of the human person. Every person has an intrinsic, innate dignity. Doesn't matter what you've done, you can't take it away. And it's sort of the Declaration of Independence, that we have certain rights. We also have a certain dignity to us that cannot be taken away. It can be violated, but it can't be taken away. And that's what I'm trying to tap into, is that innate dignity of the human person, and help other people to recognize it in themselves so that they can say, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that might be the key there, because that one guy, he saw that when he was 3 with his parents at the bar.
Yeah.
It probably took me a little bit of time in prison to really sit down and look at, what am I doing? This isn't working, let's do something different.
Right.
And maybe some other people reach that conclusion at different points. So if there's a program that can help them have that conversation with themselves, because none of this change that happened with me happened because someone forced it on me. It's like my head had to get in the game in the first place.
Right, and that happens for a lot of people. You're not alone in that.
Yeah,
it happens for a lot of people. They have that aha moment of,
that's what you need to spur. Yeah.
I don't want this anymore. I want something different. And how do I get there? So, and you're fortunate because you had family around you, and when they saw you making that shift, they were like, "This is what we've been waiting for." How can we support it? How can we push this along? Or friends or somebody was there, like, okay, Dirk's serious, so maybe we can be serious with him about doing this.
Yeah, it's funny. I asked my dad about that. Later, I was like, "Why did you pay for my education after all of this stuff I've done?"
Yeah.
And his response was a little bit different. He's like, "Well, family's obligated."
Yeah.
So he kind of just took it upon. I don't think he really believed I had changed at that point. It's like just another, whatever Dirk's doing is, who knows how that's going to shake out. But his role as a father was like, well, I should support him with his education.
Right.
This turned out for the better. So
yeah. So he didn't give up.
Yeah,
You're right.
He didn't give up.
And that's what we need around. Everybody needs those people around them, right? We all need people around us who are not going to give up on us.
That's powerful to know that there's people that have your back.
Yeah, and it's not just people in prison who need that. It's everybody, and it is the difference, I think, between a successful life and a less successful life, is that you've got people who love you in a way that they don't surrender to the worst aspects of who you are, right? Because we've all got stuff inside of us that isn't very nice and it's not very pretty and pleasant, but we need people around us who know that that's there, but then don't take the next step to say that's who you are, right?
Yeah, you're not defined by your worst act.
Yeah, you're not by your worst moment in life. Nobody should be defined by their worst moment.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I think some study came out of Berkeley, and they kind of tried to figure out how many how many ways your life is impacted by your criminal record once that happens. I think the number is like 22,000. Like there's so many ways a criminal record impacts you moving forward. Like once you get out of prison, you paid your fine.
Right.
It's never really over.
Yeah.
That's a whole different topic, of course, but I don't know how you feel.
I don't think it is. I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about in terms of, is America a punitive culture? That
pretty much, yes.
We kind of like to punish people when they do bad stuff.
And it comes maybe all the way back to the founding of the country, the puritanical point of view.
No, I think that I don't know if I want to say this or not. American society is heavily informed by Christian thought and practice, whether we recognize it or not.
Absolutely.
Right. So, to the extent that churches are modeling revenge rather than grace, I think that they're not being true to their calling, their mission, and I think it does a lot of damage and just kind of reinforcing this tendency of, oh, you made a mistake, now you're just going to have to pay the price
forever,
unless I know you, and then I'll forgive you.
Uncle Willie's different.
Yeah, my uncle, my brother, my cousin, they're all different than the abstract idea of a prisoner. So.
So there's lots more work on the table.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think that we have to, the work that you're doing, programs, other reentry programs that work one-on-one with people, is really moved by the letter that you shared.
Yeah, that was kind of unexpected.
Yeah.
It's a small thing. I figured I'd just say, like when he wrote me the initial letter, he kind of referenced that he liked to read, and we had a used bookstore. I could get a couple books, and he kind of shared what he read, and on his list he didn't have any Russian authors. So I was like, well, he needs Dostoevsky and Tolstoy.
Yeah.
I sent him two of my favorites.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know that he had Russian people in his family.
So there's a great book, came out a couple of years ago. It's co-written by the president of Northwestern University, Morton Shapiro is his name, and a literature professor. They teach a course together. He's an economist. This guy's the other guy's a literature professor. Russian literature is his specialty. And he talks about how the Russian novelists, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and others, Turgenev, really pioneered a very particular kind of novel that allows people to enter into the mental state of the characters in books.
Interesting.
And helps to foster this self-reflection. That's the whole idea behind a novel, is that you get to participate, you get to look at the world through somebody else's eyes, experience it the way they experience it.
These interesting, flawed characters too.
Right, interesting, flawed characters
which are humans.
Yeah,
that's all of us
who are humans, and so if you really want to understand the psychology of a suicide, you might be better off reading Anna Karenina than reading a bunch of studies on suicide, because he puts you in her mind where you have to experience what she's experiencing. Same thing in Crime and Punishment. What does that madness look like from the inside? So you gave this guy Russian novels. I think that's brilliant.
That's why he said he's skeptical when he got them, and then once he started tipping into Tolstoy, I think, then he just got enveloped.
Yeah,
he couldn't get he got sucked into this
because it speaks to his condition.
Yeah,
it tells him something not just about these characters but about his own life, and feeds that self-reflective process that's necessary for people to achieve this cognitive shift away from their old life and towards something new.
It's funny. I read some of those just because since you're in prison, you have plenty of time.
Yeah.
So I figured I might as well brush up on all the classics.
Uh-huh.
So I read all of those. Which
who in your family was a reader?
My mom, both my mom and my dad. My mom would read for fun. My dad was an editor for the National Audubon Society.
Okay.
He always had a manuscript open in his lap.
Right.
So I kind of read anyways, I guess.
It was modeled for
Yeah, it
you.
was a model a little bit, yeah.
In my own family, all right, so like my dad subscribed to 2 newspapers every day. We got 2 newspapers delivered. He subscribed to all 3 of the weekly news magazines, U.S. News, Time, Newsweek. They all came. Dozens of other publications. There was always something to read.
Yeah, always a newspaper open on the floor.
There's always on the table.
Yep.
Books stacked all over the place. Some of them not great books, but there were books, and so you develop the habit of reading, and that habit of reading helps people develop an interior life that can sustain them in hard times.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's actually how my education started, because I was reading a novel a day. I was like, it's short novels, like Dean Koontz, because like in prison you only have so many, not the greatest books. But it's like, man, I'm doing all this reading, I might as well learn something too. And then after I kind of got all my studies done, then I went back to reading some more. And probably the worst book to read is Jack Kerouac, because he's just exploring the world,
Right.
having, hopping on trains. And when you're in prison, you just want to go explore the world.
Yeah. And so that's like, but even that's kind of helpful in a way,
it wasn't bad in a bad way. It was like,
it was like, oh, this is what I'm missing.
Yeah.
While I'm sitting here in this cell, this is what I'm missing.
And part of that spirit is when I got out, I rode my motorcycle to Cabo and back.
Wow.
I don't think I would have done that without the. You have all these thoughts in prison, all these things you want to do. Then when you get out, you actually have to do some of them.
So interesting. You don't. That's an aspect of the loss of freedom that you don't think about. It's like when you're on the outside, there's effectively nothing standing in the way of you doing almost anything you want.
The perspective you have in prison is the problems in the real world are different. It's like there's problems in prison which are pretty serious. And then you get out in the real world and you're running a business. Nothing really matters anymore. Like the problems just don't really.
Yeah, they don't add up.
Yeah, they don't add up. It's not that big of a deal.
That's really interesting, and I think that perspective is valuable and completely lost. Just like what you give up when you go to prison is really, I think, immeasurable in some ways, because you're entering into a completely regimented and very limited life, and that's the loss of time is the biggest loss. We only get so much of it. We've all got a sell-by date, so
yeah. You're not making any more time.
Yeah.
Very cool. Thanks so much for the chat.
Well, this has been amazing.
Yeah, we can just chat all day.
Yeah, we could. I'm sure we can just keep going. I'll have you next time you're in Washington. I'll record a podcast with you and put it on the AEI site.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Are you hungry? You want to grab some lunch?
I do.
All right.
Okay.